Imagine walking into court to defend your name, and the judge himself turns against you. He mocks you, humiliates you, and abuses his power in front of everyone. But just when it seems all hope is lost, the doors swing open, and a powerful woman walks in who changes everything. What happens next will leave the entire courtroom speechless. The courtroom was silent. Not the ordinary kind of silence, but the heavy, charged silence that hangs in the air before a storm. The old wooden benches creaked as people shifted nervously, their eyes fixed on the front of the room. You could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above and the steady ticking of the courtroom clock echoing through the stillness. Behind the tall wooden bench sat Judge Harrison, a man feared more than respected. His sharp jaw, furrowed brow, and piercing blue eyes gave him a cold, almost mechanical presence. He had a reputation, a judge who prided himself on being untouchable, who believed he was the law itself. Lawyers whispered about him in hallways. Reporters loved him for his dramatic rulings, but today, even they could sense something was off. Across from him stood Karoline Leavitt, young, confident, yet visibly tense. The fluorescent lights reflected off her neat stack of documents, her trembling fingers brushing across them. She was there not as a lawyer, but as a defendant, accused in a defamation case that had drawn national attention. Cameras lined the back of the courtroom. Journalists scribbled in their notepads. Karoline's heart pounded, but she refused to show it. She stood tall, dressed professionally, her chin lifted slightly higher than her fear allowed. She had come prepared, not just with evidence, but with courage. The bailiff called for order, and all eyes turned to Judge Harrison as he leaned forward, his gaze locked on her. The air thickened. His expression was unreadable at first, then, slowly, it twisted into something cruel. "Miss Leavitt," the judge said, his voice cold as steel, "you're too young to understand real law. Maybe stick to social media instead of wasting this court's time." The words struck the room like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the audience. A few people looked at each other in disbelief. One reporter even lowered his pen mid-sentence. The sound of the insult hung in the air, echoing against the courtroom walls. Karoline's breath caught in her throat. For a brief second, she froze, shocked not just by the insult itself, but by the tone in which it was delivered. It wasn't just dismissal, it was contempt. He didn't see her as a defendant, he saw her as a child, someone unworthy of the space she was standing in. Even the court stenographer hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keys. Was she supposed to record that? Karoline blinked once, hard, pushing back the sting in her eyes. Every instinct told her to stay quiet, to let the moment pass, but something inside her refused. She had worked too hard to stand here, too long to let anyone, not even a judge, belittle her voice. She straightened her shoulders, took a steady breath, and spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling slightly at first, then growing stronger with each word. "Respect doesn't depend on age. It depends on truth." The courtroom stirred. The quiet murmur of surprise moved through the crowd like a soft wave. A few people even smiled subtly, impressed by her courage. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed. His face flushed crimson. Whether from anger or embarrassment, no one could tell. He grabbed his gavel and slammed it down hard. "Order!" he roared. The sound echoed through the wooden chamber like thunder. The bailiff flinched. The reporters froze, pens mid-air. But the damage had already been done. Everyone could feel it. Something in that courtroom had shifted. Karoline didn't move. She held her ground, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes never leaving the judge's. Harrison leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily. His glare was sharp enough to cut glass. "This is my courtroom, Ms. Leavitt," he said through clenched teeth. "You would do well to remember that." But his words didn't carry the same weight anymore. The authority in his voice had cracked, replaced with a faint trace of insecurity. Across the benches, whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you hear that?" She talked back to him. Good for her. Even the lawyers sitting near the front exchanged glances, some impressed, others silently alarmed. No one had ever stood up to Judge Harrison like that before. Karoline, though still trembling inside, allowed herself one slow exhale. She knew she had crossed a line, but it was the right one. The truth mattered more than his arrogance. The judge slammed the gavel again, harder this time. "One more outburst," he warned, his voice rising. "I will hold you in contempt." Karoline didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. For a few long seconds, the two locked eyes, a battle of authority versus conviction, power versus principle. Finally, the judge looked away. He turned to shuffle his papers, his jaw clenched, his ego wounded. The moment passed, but its echo lingered in every corner of the courtroom. Everyone watching knew it. Something irreversible had happened. The line between law and personal attack had been crossed, and the first crack had appeared in the armor of a man who believed he was untouchable. And though no one dared to say it out loud, one thought lingered in every mind present that day. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse for Karoline, the massive wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open with a deep, echoing sound. Heads turned instantly. The noise alone was enough to break the tension. But what truly silenced the room was who walked in. Through the doorway stepped Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General. Her reputation preceded her, a woman known nationwide for her iron will, calm authority, and unshakable sense of justice. She wasn't just respected, she was feared by those who thought they could manipulate the law. Her presence carried weight, the kind that made even the most confident judges sit a little straighter. The audience whispered in shock. "Is that really Pam Bondi?" Someone murmured. "Why is she here?" Another asked under their breath. Even Judge Harrison, so used to being the most powerful man in the room, froze mid-sentence. His jaw tightened as his eyes darted toward her. For the first time that morning, the mask of arrogance slipped, replaced with a flicker of unease. Pam walked with measured steps, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her tailored navy suit, perfectly pressed, glimmered under the courtroom lights. She nodded politely to the bailiff, her eyes calm but observant, scanning the entire room as though she could already sense the imbalance in the air. The bailiff leaned in slightly, lowering his voice nervously. "Miss Bondi, what brings you here?" Pam gave a small, confident smile, the kind that revealed nothing and everything all at once. "I'm here to observe this trial," she said evenly. Her tone was calm, but her words hit like a thunderclap. Everyone knew exactly what that meant. Pam Bondi wasn't there out of curiosity. She was there to watch him. Karoline turned slightly, her eyes widening in disbelief as she recognized the woman who had just walked in. It was as if a flicker of hope had re-entered the room, a sign that someone, somewhere, had finally noticed what was happening. Pam took a seat quietly in the second row, right behind Karoline's defense table. She didn't say a word. She simply opened a sleek black notebook, clicked her pen, and began to observe. The trial continued, but now there was an invisible shift in power. As Karoline presented her evidence, the judge's irritation grew more visible. He leaned forward, interrupting her mid-sentence. "That's irrelevant," he snapped. She tried again, steadying her voice. "Your Honor, this directly supports—" "I said irrelevant," he barked, slamming his hand on the desk. A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. The tension was thick again, but this time, Pam's eyes didn't miss a thing.
Every sneer, every sarcastic smirk that crossed the judge's face, she noted it down. When Karoline's lawyer stood to object, Judge Harrison rolled his eyes dramatically before mocking his tone. "Counselor," he sneered, "if I wanted a lecture, I'd attend one of your law school classes." Laughter rippled faintly from the prosecution's side, But Pam's expression remained stone cold. She kept writing. Karoline tried to stay strong, but her frustration was beginning to show. Every time she made a valid point, the judge shut her down. Every time her lawyer cited precedent, the judge twisted his interpretation. It wasn't just unfair. It was calculated. Pam could feel it, the undercurrent of bias, the personal animosity, the disregard for due process. Her instincts as a former prosecutor screamed at her that this was more than arrogance. This was corruption disguised as authority. As the judge paused to shuffle through some papers, Pam's eyes flicked to the gallery, reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers all whispering behind their hands. The tension was now a living thing, filling every inch of the room. When the court finally called for a brief recess, Harrison exited through his private chamber door, the gavel slamming loudly behind him. Karoline slumped slightly, exhaling the breath she'd been holding. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering reassurance, but his voice trembled too. Meanwhile, Pam closed her notebook slowly. She stood up, calm and composed, and made her way toward the hallway. A few people stepped aside instinctively as she passed. Her face showed no emotion, but her stride was purposeful. Once outside the courtroom, she reached into her bag, took out her phone, and dialed a number from memory. The call connected instantly. "Bondi here." The other end replied with a single word. "Ma'am?" Pam's voice remained calm, but beneath that calmness was steel. "This isn't a trial anymore," she said, her tone sharp, controlled, and decisive. "It's a violation of justice. Start the process." There was silence for a second. Then the voice on the other end responded, "Understood." Pam ended the call, slipped the phone back into her purse, and looked through the glass pane of the courtroom doors. Inside, she could still see Karoline sitting at the defense table, tired, shaken, but still holding her ground. If you were inspired by this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss stories that reveal truth, courage, and justice. Because here, every story reminds us that no one is above the law. Pam's eyes softened for a brief moment, then her jaw tightened again. She turned and walked down the corridor with quiet determination, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Something had just been set in motion, and by the time this day was over, Judge Harrison would regret every word he said. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people returned from recess. A few glances were thrown toward the door, where Pam Bondi sat quietly in the back row, her expression unreadable, her presence calm yet commanding. Judge Harrison walked back in, his robe flowing behind him like a shadow. The moment he sat down, the gavel struck sharply. "Court is now in session." But the usual authority in his tone was gone. It trembled slightly, as though even he could feel the shift in the air. Karoline Leavitt sat at her table, her eyes low but her mind racing. She knew something had changed. She could feel it. Pam's presence wasn't just coincidence. The judge shuffled his papers. "Let's continue," he muttered. But before he could move forward, a voice rang out. "Your Honor," said Pam Bondi, standing slowly. Her voice was firm, steady, the kind that instantly silences a room. The judge's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed. "Miss Bondi," he said, frowning deeply, "you're not representing anyone here." Pam took a few steps forward, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. "That's true," she replied, calm but sharp. "But I am representing justice, something this court seems to have forgotten today." A hush fell over the room. Reporters stopped mid-note. The air thickened as every head turned to watch the confrontation unfold. The judge paused to shuffle through some papers. Pam's eyes flicked to the gallery. Reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers, all whispering behind their hands. The tension was now a living thing, filling every inch of the room.
"With all due respect, Your Honor," she said slowly, "this is no longer your courtroom. It's the people's, and they deserve to see justice served fairly." A murmur swept through the gallery. Even the stenographer hesitated, unsure whether to record what was happening. The judge slammed his gavel down. "Bang! Order! I said order!" he roared. But his voice cracked, and the crack was all it took for the room to realize that his control was slipping. Pam turned to face the spectators, her voice steady but louder now, echoing across the wooden walls. "This judge," she declared, "has violated ethical conduct, insulted a defendant publicly, and shown clear bias from the very beginning of this trial." The words landed like thunder. Gasps filled the courtroom. "I have already filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Oversight Committee, and as of this moment, a judicial investigation has begun." The gallery erupted in shock. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Pens scratched furiously. Cameras clicked. The bailiff looked from Pam to the judge, unsure of what to do. Judge Harrison's face turned an angry shade of red. "Miss Bondi," he shouted, "you have no right to—" But before he could finish, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Thud! 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The sound of their boots hitting the wooden floor echoed like drumbeats. Everyone fell silent. The officers walked with purpose, straight toward the bench. Their faces were stern, emotionless. The tension in the room was unbearable. Judge Harrison froze, his mouth fell open, and for the first time that day, his arrogance vanished. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, his voice shaking slightly. One officer stopped in front of him and produced a folded document. "Judge Harrison, you are under immediate investigation by the State Judicial Commission. You are to step down from your position effective immediately." The courtroom collectively gasped. "This is outrageous," the judge shouted, rising from his chair. "You can't do this. I'm the judge here." Pam's expression remained calm. She stepped closer, her voice now quiet, but cutting through the noise like a blade.
"No, Harrison," she said, "you were the judge. Now you're just another man who thought he was untouchable." The officer gestured politely but firmly. "Sir, please come with us." The judge looked around, his eyes darting across the crowd, searching for support, but there was none. Even the lawyers who once feared him now looked away. His own clerk avoided eye contact. His hands trembled as he realized the truth. The power he had abused had just turned against him. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but his voice lacked strength. The officers took him by the arm and led him away. The gavel slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor with a hollow echo that seemed to mark the end of an era. As the doors closed behind him, a deep silence filled the room. Pam stood still, breathing quietly. Her gaze softened as she turned toward Karoline, who sat frozen in disbelief. Karoline's eyes welled with tears, a mix of relief and gratitude. Pam approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over now," she said gently. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." The reporters erupted again, shouting questions, flashes firing like lightning. But Pam ignored them. She simply turned to the judge's empty seat, and for a long moment, she stared at the symbol of authority that had been corrupted and restored in one day. Then she turned back to Karoline and smiled faintly. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about courage. The courage to stand up when everyone else stays silent. And as Pam Bondi walked out of the courtroom, the audience rose instinctively, not out of habit, but out of respect.
The gavel lay silent on the floor. But for the first time that day, justice had spoken.
But before he could finish, a calm, steady voice cut through the tension. Pam Bondi. She stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Every eye turned to her. "Oh, we can," she said evenly. "You see, the Department of Justice takes judicial misconduct very seriously, especially when it involves abuse of authority." Her words sliced through the air like a blade. Gasps filled the courtroom again, louder this time, mixed with whispers. The same people who had once feared Judge Harrison now watched in shock, almost disbelief, as the mighty man behind the bench began to crumble. The judge's face turned pale. He slammed his gavel down in panic. "This is my courtroom," he snapped. "You have no jurisdiction here." But his voice no longer carried power, only desperation. One of the officers calmly stepped closer. "Sir, please place the gavel down. You are under investigation for obstruction of justice, verbal abuse, and tampering with court proceedings." The judge froze mid-motion. His mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes flickered toward the crowd, searching for support, for someone, anyone, to defend him. But no one spoke. Even the bailiff, who had once jumped at his command, stood frozen. Pam crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You've used this courtroom as a weapon, Harrison," she said quietly. "Today, it becomes a mirror." The judge's jaw tightened. I didn't mean—" His words cracked, the last fragments of authority breaking apart. "Tell it to your attorney," Pam replied coldly. Then came the moment no one thought they would ever see. One of the officers stepped up the bench and gently took the gavel from Harrison's hand. The other officer moved behind him. The sound of metal clicking, the handcuffs locking into place, echoed louder than any gavel strike that had ever filled that room. The audience gasped again, not in fear, but in awe. The once untouchable judge now stood trembling, wrists bound in silver. Reporters began whispering frantically, snapping photos, filming every second. The camera flashes bounced off the walls like lightning. Karoline Leavitt sat still, hands clasped tightly in front of her. For the first time since the trial began, she exhaled deeply, a breath of relief that seemed to carry all her pain and frustration away. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered, "It's over." She nodded slowly, eyes still on Pam Bondi, the woman who had turned the tide. Pam didn't smile. She simply watched as the officers guided the disgraced judge from his bench. His shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. The man who once towered over everyone now looked small, just another person facing the justice he once denied others. As he was escorted toward the exit, the crowd parted. No one said a word. Only the sound of his footsteps remained, slow, reluctant, defeated. The courtroom that once echoed with his arrogance now stood in silence. But it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence
Pam
of balance
turned toward Karoline.
being restored.
Their eyes met across the room, one filled with quiet gratitude, the other with calm assurance. Pam gave a single nod. "Justice has finally entered this room," she said softly, just loud enough for Karoline to hear. Karoline smiled faintly through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Pam looked toward the judge's empty chair, still high above the rest, but now meaningless. The symbol of power that had once been used to intimidate now stood as a reminder of accountability. "Let this day be remembered," Pam said quietly, glancing at the reporters who hung on her every word. "No one is above the law, not even the ones who enforce it." Outside, the muffled sound of cameras clicking and people shouting could already be heard. But inside, it was peace. True, powerful, earned peace. Karoline finally stood, gathered her papers, and walked toward the exit. As she passed Pam, she stopped. "You didn't just defend me," she said softly. "You defended what's right." Pam smiled for the first time. That's what justice is supposed to do. And as the doors closed behind them, the courtroom remained still, empty now, but alive with the echo of truth finally spoken aloud. For the first time in a long time, justice didn't just sit behind the bench. It stood tall in the room. Hours had passed since Judge Harrison's shocking arrest. The courthouse, which had been filled with shouting, gasps, and flashing lights, now stood under the calm orange glow of the late afternoon sun. Outside, the media swarmed like waves crashing against the courthouse steps. Reporters held microphones high, their voices overlapping as camera shutters clicked in bursts of rapid fire. The air buzzed with questions, curiosity, and disbelief. Pam Bondi emerged first, calm and composed, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Beside her walked Karoline Leavitt, no longer the woman trembling under the weight of the judge's insults, but someone changed, stronger, taller in spirit. The crowd immediately surged forward. "Ms. Bondi! Ms. Bondi!" one reporter shouted over the noise. "Was this planned? Did you expect the arrest to happen today?" Pam paused at the top of the courthouse steps, letting the noise settle. Then she looked out at the sea of cameras and said with quiet authority, "No. Justice doesn't need to be planned. It just needs someone brave enough to stand up for it." The words struck like lightning. For a second, even the reporters stopped talking. The weight of her sentence hung in the air, simple but powerful. Karoline stepped forward beside her, her hands clasped in front of her, voice steady but emotional. "I came here today to defend myself. I didn't expect to witness something far bigger. A reminder that even the powerful must answer for their actions." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Some of the reporters even lowered their microphones, just listening. For weeks, people had watched the trial unfold like a drama. A young woman standing up against authority, mocked and humiliated by a man who thought his robe made him untouchable. But today, the story had flipped. Today, truth had spoken louder than power. Applause broke out, rare for a courthouse press line. Cameras flashed in rhythm with the clapping, catching the moment as if history itself wanted proof it had happened. Pam gave a small nod to Karoline, pride flickering briefly in her eyes. Then she turned back to the cameras and said with quiet authority, "Let this serve as a message. The law exists to protect, not to intimidate. When someone uses their position to humiliate or silence another, they betray the very system they swore to uphold." Inside, the courthouse had grown silent. The echo of the day's chaos had faded into a strange stillness. The benches were empty. Papers lay scattered across the floor where reporters had once crowded. And on the judge's desk, the gavel, once slammed with arrogance and cruelty, lay abandoned. Its handle was slightly tilted, the metal band catching a glint of the fading sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. The symbol of control had lost its power. Pam looked back once more before walking down the steps. "Funny," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That gavel silenced others for years. Today, it silenced itself." Karoline smiled faintly. "Poetic justice," she whispered. As they reached the bottom of the courthouse stairs, a cool evening breeze brushed past them, carrying the faint sound of cheering from across the street. People had gathered, ordinary citizens, some holding signs, others simply standing in awe. A woman from the crowd shouted, "Thank you, Pam! Thank you, Karoline!" Pam raised her hand slightly in acknowledgement, her expression still steady, but her eyes softer now. She turned to Karoline. "You handled yourself with grace. You reminded everyone that truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs courage." Karoline's eyes shimmered. "Thanks to you," she said quietly, "I didn't lose hope." Pam placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And remember this," she said, "justice is loud when courage speaks." The two women walked side by side as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The courthouse behind them glowed in the warm light, its stone facade transformed from a place of intimidation into a symbol of change. For a moment, everything felt still, like time itself paused to mark the moment when justice truly shifted. Karoline glanced back once more at the courthouse. "Do you think people will remember this?" she asked softly. Pam smiled. "They already are." Ahead of them, the cameras continued flashing, not just two women walking, but two figures symbolizing something greater. It wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the beginning of a message that would echo far beyond those courtroom walls. Replayed on every news broadcast, every social media feed, every home where people had felt powerless. That message was simple, but it carried the weight of history. No one, not even a judge, is above the law. The last rays of sunlight framed the two women as they disappeared into the crowd, no longer victims or defenders, but voices of something timeless. And as the courthouse doors finally closed for the night, the sound that lingered wasn't chaos or applause. It was the quiet, steady heartbeat of justice finally being heard.